Welcome, wanderers of the dark past. Tonight, we descend into the quiet corridors of history, where the stories of death are written not by men, but by women whose cruelty outlived their names. These are the forgotten female serial killers of history. They were queens, servants, wives, and healers. They smiled while they killed. They prayed before the murders. And then they vanished from the pages of time, buried beneath the myths of their male counterparts. So settle in. Let the night embrace you. Because tonight, we begin with one of the most infamous names ever whispered through the candlelit halls of Europe. Elizabeth Báthory, the Blood Countess of Hungary. They called her a monster. They said she bathed in blood to stay young forever. But what if the truth was darker than that legend? She was born in 1560 into one of the most powerful noble families in Transylvania, a child of privilege, intelligence, and immense influence. The Báthory family was ancient, their lands vast, their names spoken with both reverence and fear. Elizabeth grew up surrounded by war, superstition, and cruelty, a world where power excused everything. Even as a girl, she was brilliant and volatile. Historical letters describe her as educated beyond most women of her time. She spoke Latin, German, Hungarian, and Greek. But intelligence can be dangerous when combined with unchecked power. At the age of 15, she married Count Ferenc Nadasdy, a soldier famed for his brutality on the battlefield. When he left for war, Elizabeth was left to manage the vast estates, hundreds of servants, and countless peasants. It was then that the whispers began. At first, it was small things. A maid who disappeared. A young girl who entered the castle and was never seen again. The Countess was known for her temper. She demanded obedience, precision, silence. But silence in her world was also a weapon. When her husband died in 1604, the true reign of terror began. With her loyal servants, Anna Darvulia, Ilona Yo, and others, Elizabeth built what could only be described as a fortress of horror. Girls were brought to the castle, often under the pretense of employment or education. They came willingly, unaware of the fate that awaited them. Testimonies later described unspeakable acts. The girls were beaten until their skins split. They were burned with hot irons, pinned with needles, starved, or left to freeze in the snow. Some accounts even claimed that Elizabeth bit her victims, tearing flesh from their faces. The legend says she bathed in their blood to preserve her youth. But historians argue this was a metaphor, a tale spun by her enemies to amplify her monstrosity. Yet the truth remains. She tortured and killed young women for over a decade. By the time she was caught, more than 600 victims were rumored to have perished under her command. 600! That number still echoes in the corridors of history. Terrifying, unbelievable, and perhaps exaggerated. But even if a fraction of it were true, Elizabeth Báthory remains one of the deadliest women who ever lived. The story of her downfall begins not with guilt, but with politics. You see, powerful women in 17th century Hungary were always one scandal away from destruction, and Elizabeth was too powerful. She owned vast estates. She lent money to nobles. She even defied royal orders. King Matthias II, heavily indebted to her family, found the perfect excuse to eliminate his financial burden. When the first bodies were discovered, it wasn't the king's conscience that reacted. It was his greed. He ordered her arrest, eager to seize her wealth. In 1610, soldiers stormed Castle Chuktis. They found corpses. They found mutilated girls. They found servants eager to confess, perhaps under torture, perhaps from guilt. Elizabeth herself never confessed. She refused to speak in her defense, standing tall, regal, unrepentant. And because of her noble blood, she could not be executed. Instead, she was sealed inside her own castle, bricked into her chambers, with only a small slit for air and food. There, in that darkness, she remained for 4 long years. Her beauty faded, her power vanished, but her legend only grew. She died in 1614, found cold and still, slumped beside her stone wall. But centuries later, historians began to ask, was she truly guilty of everything she was accused of? Or was she, at least in part, a victim of her time?
It's true that noble women were often accused of witchcraft, lust, and madness when they defied men. It's true that much of the evidence came from tortured servants. And it's true that her lands and wealth were swiftly confiscated after her death. Some scholars claim she was framed. Others believe the evidence was overwhelming. Perhaps both are true. Perhaps Elizabeth Báthory was not a monster born, but one made by a society that allowed cruelty to bloom behind castle walls. Her legend became something greater than history, a Gothic myth of vanity, blood, and feminine evil. She became the archetype of the female vampire. Bram Stoker's Dracula would echo her spirit centuries later. Films, books, and horror tales still whisper her name. And so the Blood Countess lives on, not as a woman, but as a shadow, a reflection of power gone unchecked, a reminder that evil is not bound by gender, but by opportunity. In the flicker of candlelight, imagine her face, once beautiful, now lost to time. Was it the face of madness or the mask of vengeance? Did she truly bathe in blood, or were those red stains merely the lies of men who feared a woman's strength? History offers no mercy, no clarity, only silence. And in that silence, Elizabeth Báthory remains eternal. The Blood Countess ruled from her castle of stone. Our next killer ruled from silence, behind the gilded doors of Russian nobility. She was not born in darkness. She was born into privilege, baptized under the golden domes of the Orthodox Church, and raised to believe that wealth was divine will. Her name was Darya Nikolaevna Saltykova, but history would remember her only as Saltychiha, the she-devil of Moscow. They said she smiled like an angel. They said she prayed every morning. And yet, behind the carved doors of her mansion, the screams of women echoed through the corridors, screams that the world ignored for years. It began in the 1750s in Imperial Russia. The empire was vast, frozen, and cruel. Peasants were property, landowners were gods, and Darya, a wealthy widow, inherited hundreds of serfs, men and women bound to her land, unable to leave, unable to defy her.
Her husband, Gleb Saltykov, died young. His death left her with 2 sons, an enormous estate, and a loneliness that began to fester into something far darker. At first, she was admired. Young, beautiful, pious. She attended church regularly, donated to the poor, and presented the image of an ideal noblewoman. But beneath that perfection, there was a fracture, a sickness of the soul that no priest could cure. It began with anger, a broken vase, a misplaced key, a wrinkled dress. For the smallest mistakes, she would lash out, whipping her female servants until their backs bled. At first, the punishment seemed typical of the era. Corporal punishment was accepted. No one questioned a noblewoman's right to discipline her serfs. But soon, her rage grew monstrous. Daria began to find pleasure in cruelty. She would invent reasons to strike, to burn, to kill. She watched the pain, her eyes wide and alive. They said she sometimes laughed. One servant girl was beaten to death because she brushed Daria's hair too roughly. Another was tied outside in the snow, left to freeze overnight. A third was doused with boiling water, while others were forced to watch. No one dared to resist her, because in that time, the life of a peasant woman was worth less than the candlelight that illuminated her mistress's chamber. The murders continued for years. By the time rumors reached Moscow, more than 100 women had vanished from her estate. Most were young, most were female, and most were buried in unmarked graves. But in the eyes of the law, her victims were nothing. Complaints from peasants were dismissed before they even reached the court. Who would dare accuse a noblewoman of murder? Still, whispers spread. Servants fled. Priests grew uneasy. Finally, in a rare act of courage, 2 peasants, husbands of murdered women, traveled all the way to St. Petersburg to appeal directly to Empress Catherine the Great.
They carried no wealth, no status, only grief. They begged for justice, and somehow the Empress listened. The investigation began quietly. Officials gathered testimonies, spoke to witnesses, exhumed bodies from shallow graves. The truth was more horrifying than rumor. They discovered dozens of corpses. They heard hundreds of accounts. Beatings, drownings, tortures with hot irons, bones broken with sticks. The witnesses trembled as they spoke. Some had seen their sisters die. Others had been forced to participate under threat of death. When Daria was finally arrested in 1762, she didn't protest. She seemed almost bored, as if the law were a minor inconvenience to her divine right to rule. But when faced with the accusations, her mask began to slip. Her arrogance gave way to confusion, then fury, then silence. She was not insane in the medical sense. She was something worse, utterly convinced of her own righteousness. She believed her servants were wicked. She believed she was purifying them through pain. The trial lasted 6 years. 6 years of testimonies, investigations, and political caution, because no one knew how to punish a woman of her rank. Catherine the Great wanted justice, but she also wanted to prove that even nobles were not above the law. When the verdict came in 1768, it was a compromise between punishment and symbolism. Daria Saltykova was convicted of murdering 138 people, mostly young women. Her property was confiscated, her noble title stripped, and she was sentenced to life imprisonment in a convent dungeon. On the day of her sentencing, she was chained to a platform in Red Square. Crowds gathered from all over Moscow to see her face, the monster in human form. A sign hung around her neck. This woman tortured and murdered. She stood for an hour, expressionless,
while the crowd hurled insults and stones. Then she was led away, disappearing into the cold, silent cell where she would spend the rest of her life. The cell was small and windowless, lit only by the flicker of an oil lamp. She could hear the prayers of nuns above her, but she could not join them. Her meals were passed through a slot in the door. Her only companions were the ghosts of the women she'd killed. For 33 years she lived in that darkness, no longer feared, no longer rich, no longer divine. When she died in 1801, she was 71 years old, a frail, forgotten relic of cruelty. Her body was buried without ceremony. Her name faded from public memory, hidden beneath centuries of Russian silence. But even now, her story lingers. Because Darya Saltykova wasn't a myth. She wasn't a creature of superstition or rumor. She was real. And her crimes remind us of a simple, chilling truth, that power and violence are not bound by gender, and evil can thrive behind the facade of prayer and propriety. Her case shocked Russia. It forced a conversation about justice, about class, about the limits of nobility. Catherine the Great used her downfall as proof that the law could reach even the highest born. But for the peasants, it was too late. Generations of suffering had already passed in silence. Saltychika became a ghost story whispered among servants, a warning about cruelty, a symbol of the sins hidden behind lace and candlelight. And perhaps that's the most haunting thing of all. Not the murders themselves, but the years of indifference that allowed them to happen. The way servants bowed, priests looked away, and neighbors pretended not to hear. Evil doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and the world chooses not to listen. Next time, we traveled from frozen Russia to the fog-covered streets of Victorian England, where a woman named Mary Ann Cotton poisoned her way through husbands, children, and friends, and became Britain's first recognized female serial killer.
By now, you've met killers who hid behind power, a countess in her castle, a noblewoman in her manor. But tonight's story is different. Our killer had no fortune, no influence, no guards to protect her. She lived among the poor, the forgotten, and the sick. And yet she left behind a trail of bodies so long it chilled even the hardest hearts of Victorian England. Her name was Mary Ann Cotton, and she was known by many names: wife, mother, nurse, widow. But history remembers her as something else entirely: the first female serial killer in British history. Mary Ann was born in 1832 in a small mining village in County Durham. The world she entered was gray, soot-covered, and suffocating. Coal dust settled on every windowsill. Poverty settled on every soul. Her father worked in the mines, a dangerous, unforgiving life. When she was 8 years old, he fell to his death down a mine shaft. His body was shattered, his family left destitute. It was then that Mary Ann learned two lessons: that life was fragile and that survival demanded sacrifice. Her mother remarried, but Mary Ann despised her stepfather. At 16, she fled home to work as a nursemaid, quiet, polite, efficient. She was well-liked, though somewhat distant. No one could have imagined that behind her gentle smile, darkness was already stirring. At 20, she married a man named William Mowbray, a colliery laborer. Together they had children, Many children, too many for a poor family to feed. And then, one by one, the children began to die. Fevers, the doctors said, stomach troubles. Such illnesses were common among the poor, so no one questioned it. But as each child died, Marianne collected the small but significant sum from their life insurance. It wasn't much, but it was enough to survive. By the time she and William moved to Sunderland, they had lost 5 children. William soon followed them to the grave. His death certificate listed intestinal fever, but the symptoms, vomiting, stomach pain, convulsions, would later be recognized as the telltale signs of arsenic poisoning.
Arsenic, the silent killer of the Victorian age. It was everywhere. Rat poison, cosmetics, wallpaper dyes, even household candles. Easy to buy, easy to hide. And it killed in agony. Marianne knew this well. She used it with precision. A pinch in a cup of tea, a few granules in stew. The poison worked slowly, mimicking disease. By the time the victim screamed, it was too late. When William died, Marianne wasted no time. She collected his insurance payout and moved on. New town, new job, new man. Her second husband, George Ward, was a patient at the infirmary where she worked as a nurse. He was sickly, kind, and utterly smitten with her. Within a year, they were married. Within another year, he was dead. Once again, the cause was recorded as intestinal disorder. Once again, Marianne collected the money and disappeared. Then came James Robinson, a widower with 4 children. She became his housekeeper, then his lover. When his children fell ill and died, James began to suspect something was wrong. But before he could act, she was pregnant. He married her out of duty and fear. When his savings began to vanish and he discovered her stealing, he threw her out. It was the first time one of her husbands survived. Marianne wandered again, destitute, angry, desperate. Everywhere she went, death followed like a shadow. In 1870, she married Frederick Cotton, a miner and widower. He had 2 sons from his previous marriage, and soon Marianne gave birth to another. Neighbors saw a happy family, at least for a time. But behind closed doors, Frederick complained of stomach pains. Days later, he was dead.
Then one son, then another, then a lover who had come to comfort her after her husband's passing. Each death profitable, each death quiet. The pattern was clear to everyone, except the authorities. Victorian England was a world where poor women's tragedies were invisible. No one questioned the misfortunes of a widow who lost her family to disease. Death was everywhere. Her crimes simply hid within it. But fate at last intervened. In 1872, she took in a boarder, Thomas Riley, a parish official. She told him her stepson Charles Cotton was a burden and asked for help placing the boy in a workhouse. When Riley refused, she reportedly muttered, "He'll go before me. I won't be troubled long." Days later, the boy was dead. Riley was horrified. He contacted the police, and this time, they listened. An autopsy was ordered. Inside the child's stomach, the examiner found traces of arsenic. Marianne Cotton was arrested immediately. Her trial was sensational. The newspapers painted her as the embodiment of evil, a black widow with a calm voice and a venomous heart. But Marianne was no screaming madwoman. She was cold, polite, almost indifferent. She denied everything, insisting that all her family had died of natural causes. The evidence, however, was damning. Arsenic residues were found in multiple victims. Witnesses testified to her purchasing poison. Doctors confirmed the symptoms, and that fateful statement to Riley sealed her fate. After a brief deliberation, the jury found her guilty of murder. On March 24, 1873, she was hanged at Durham Jail. Executioners of the time were not experts. The drop was miscalculated.
When the trapdoor fell, the rope did not snap her neck cleanly. Mary Ann Cotton hung there, gasping, choking, struggling for nearly 4 minutes before death came. The crowd watched in silence. Some said she died without remorse. Others swore they saw fear in her eyes for the first time. She was 38 years old. After her death, investigators began connecting the dots. 4 husbands, a lover, her mother, and at least 11 children, possibly as many as 20 victims in total. All poisoned, all by her hand. Her story exposed the dangers of blind faith in domestic women. In the Victorian mind, the home was sacred, a place of nurture and purity. But Mary Ann Cotton turned it into a slaughterhouse. She killed not with rage, but with method. She killed not for pleasure, but for gain. And in doing so, she blurred the line between survival and sin. The newspapers called her the devil in petticoats. Songs were written about her. Children sang in the streets, "Mary Ann Cotton, she's dead and she's rotten, lying in bed with her eyes wide open." Her name became a rhyme, her crimes a cautionary tale. She was the face of Victorian horror, the proof that monsters could live next door, wear aprons, and smile. But behind the horror lies something even darker, a reflection of the world that created her, a society that left women powerless, desperate, and invisible, a world where poison became a form of control, one of the few weapons available to those trapped in domestic prisons. Mary Ann Cotton was both villain and victim of her age, a woman molded by poverty, sharpened by survival, and consumed by greed. Her poison dripped not just into teacups, but into the very soul of a society that refused to see its own decay. And so, the widow's poison claimed her place among history's forgotten killers. A gentle voice, a calm hand, and a deadly secret.
There's a certain kind of evil that hides behind kindness, a smile that feels safe, a voice that sounds like home. And sometimes, the deadliest hands are the ones that offer comfort. Tonight, we step into early 20th century America, into a quiet Connecticut town where life moved at the pace of a Sunday prayer, a place where trust was currency and faith was law. And in the middle of that world stood a woman named Amy Archer Gilligan, a name that still echoes through American true crime as the Angel of Death. Her story begins, as many do, with good intentions, but it ends with graves. Amy Duggan was born in 1873 in a modest family in rural Connecticut. Her childhood was ordinary, perhaps even happy. She grew up in a deeply religious household where charity was seen as a virtue and service to others was the path to heaven. From a young age, Amy was drawn to caregiving, the sick, the elderly, the frail. She seemed destined to help. At 20, she married James Archer, a hard-working man who shared her dreams of building a life rooted in compassion.
Together, they opened their first boarding home in 1901, a simple place where elderly residents could live out their last years with dignity and care. They called it the Archer Home for the Elderly and Infirm. For a time, it was everything the small town of Windsor needed: warm meals, clean beds, gentle nurses, and a matron whose smile could calm even the most anxious soul. Amy Archer was seen as an angel of mercy. She prayed with her residents, she held their hands in their final hours, and when they died, as the old inevitably do, she arranged their funerals, shed tears at their graves, and sent letters of condolence to their families. But the dead began to pile up. It started subtly. An old woman here, an old man there. Nothing unusual. After all, they were elderly, frail, and often sick. But the frequency was unsettling. In some months, 3, 4, even 5 residents died under Amy's care, and with every death came a signature, carefully written by the deceased just days before their passing, a new will. Each one naming Amy Archer Gilligan as the sole beneficiary. Her neighbors whispered, but quietly, who would accuse a church-going woman, a caretaker of the sick, of something so monstrous? Death was part of her job. And besides, Amy always seemed so kind.
In 1910, tragedy struck closer to home. Her husband, James, fell ill. He complained of stomach pains, weakness, and strange burning sensations. Within days, he was dead. The doctor listed the cause as acute indigestion. Amy wept at the funeral, and then she collected the life insurance payout. Months later, she married again, a man named Michael Gilligan, a wealthy widower who moved into the home. But less than a year later, Michael, too, was dead. The cause, again, was recorded as acute illness. And again, Amy inherited everything. 2 husbands, gone. Dozens of elderly residents, gone. And the angel of death continued her work. By 1913, the Windsor home had gained a reputation, not for its care, but for its mortality rate. Rumors swirled that residents rarely lasted long. Families grew uneasy. Yet, Amy continued to advertise in local newspapers. Elderly people cared for in a comfortable home. Only one vacancy. Apply soon. It was brilliant. She created an illusion of demand, urgency, and compassion. And it worked. Her home was always full. But her greed had begun to outgrow her restraint. She started encouraging residents to take out life insurance policies, naming her as beneficiary. Some she persuaded to lend her money, others to rewrite wills in her favor. And when the paperwork was done, death followed soon after. It wasn't until the death of one particular man, Franklin Andrews, that her quiet killing spree began to unravel. Franklin was a robust, cheerful man in his 60s, still strong and full of life. He enjoyed gardening, reading, and helping other residents. In May 1914, he suddenly fell violently ill after drinking a cup of lemonade prepared by Amy. By evening, he was dead. When his sister, Nellie Pierce, came to collect his belongings, she found letters Amy had written, letters demanding money. Nellie was suspicious. Her brother had been healthy. She brought the letters to the local district attorney. Soon, an investigation was opened.
The police began to dig, literally. They exhumed the bodies of several former residents.
Each autopsy revealed the same result: arsenic poisoning. The sweet, silent killer had returned, this time in the hands of a smiling widow. When authorities searched Amy's home, they found bottles of poison hidden among her medicine supplies. They also uncovered dozens of forged wills, bank receipts, and letters of debt. The truth was horrifying. Over the course of a decade, Amy Archer Gilligan had likely murdered between 20 and 60 people, though some estimates suggest even more. She had turned her boarding home into a death factory, one cup of lemonade at a time. Her trial in 1917 became a national sensation. The newspapers dubbed her the Sister of Charity in murder. They printed illustrations of her face, plump cheeks, calm eyes, a matronly smile that belied the carnage beneath. Amy sat quietly in court, knitting, praying, even smiling. When the charges were read, she denied them all. She claimed that her residents had simply died of old age, that her husband had been ill, that the wills were genuine. But the evidence was overwhelming. When the verdict came, the courtroom was silent. She was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to death by hanging. But her lawyers appealed, citing insanity. The court agreed. In 1924, Amy Archer Gilligan was declared mentally unstable and committed to the Connecticut Hospital for the Insane. She lived there for more than 30 years. They said she spent her days quietly, tending to the hospital gardens, speaking softly to nurses, attending chapel services. Sometimes she would hum hymns to herself. Sometimes she asked for forgiveness. And sometimes she didn't. She died in 1962 at the age of 89, peacefully, in her sleep. When the world looked back on her crimes, it was left with unease. Amy didn't fit the image of a killer. She wasn't angry, violent, or wild. She was calm, composed, and deliberate. A predator hidden in plain sight. Her victims trusted her completely. They believed she cared for them. And in a way, she did, until the moment she didn't. Her story inspired plays, films, and even black comedies. The most famous was Arsenic and Old Lace, where two sweet old ladies offer poisoned wine to lonely old men. It was fiction, but the seed of that horror, the quiet smile of Amy Archer Gilligan, was all too real.
She taught the world that evil doesn't always wear a scowl. Sometimes it wears an apron. Sometimes it brings you tea. Sometimes it prays for your soul while your body grows cold. And as her legend faded into the dusty archives of American true crime, one truth remained: that trust can kill, and mercy can be a mask for murder. Italy, 1939. The air was heavy with fear. The world was preparing for war again, and in small towns scattered across the Italian countryside, survival meant obedience. The church watched over the souls, the state watched over the bodies, and the poor watched over each other. In the quiet town of Correggio in northern Italy, a small, plump woman kept her door open to anyone who needed comfort. Her name was Leonarda Cinciulli. She was a fortune teller, a baker, a neighbor everyone trusted. She told jokes, she offered coffee, she promised protection from evil spirits. And inside her home, she turned human flesh into soap. To understand how she became the soap maker of Correggio, we have to go back to her childhood, steeped in fear and superstition. Leonarda was born in 1894 in a small village in southern Italy. Her mother, bitter and resentful, believed her daughter was cursed from birth. Her father was absent, cold, and often cruel.
Leonarda claimed that her mother cursed her before she was even born. A dark wish whispered over her cradle that she would know nothing but pain. And for much of her life, that curse seemed to come true. She attempted suicide as a young woman, not once, but twice. Her first husband abandoned her. Her second, a quiet civil servant named Raffaele Pansardi, tried to give her stability, but the world would not allow it. Their home was destroyed by an earthquake. Their children fell ill one after another. 17 pregnancies, and only 4 children survived. 17. Imagine burying 13 of your own children before they've learned to speak your name. It shattered something inside her.
When her only surviving son, Giuseppe, announced that he had been called to serve in Mussolini's army, Leonarda broke. She couldn't lose him too. Not to war, not to fate, not to the curse she believed haunted her family. So she turned to magic, old, desperate magic. She visited fortune-tellers, palm readers, and mystics. One told her, "In your right hand I see prison, in your left a criminal asylum." Another told her, "You will outlive all your children." Those words haunted her. She believed she could change destiny, but only through sacrifice, and so she decided to give the universe what it demanded. She would make an offering, a life for a life. Leonarda owned a small home that doubled as a fortune-telling parlor. She was well-liked, known for her charm and her sweet almond cakes. When women came to her seeking help, love, luck, or protection, she offered advice and something darker. Her first victim was Faustina Setti, a lonely, middle-aged spinster who came seeking love. Leonarda told her she had found a perfect match, a wealthy man in Pola. But she warned Faustina to tell no one, to write letters to her family in advance explaining that she was leaving, and to visit her house before her departure for a final blessing. Faustina followed her instructions faithfully. On the day she was to leave, she arrived with all her savings, 30,000 lire. Leonarda welcomed her warmly, poured her a glass of wine, and waited until her guest began to feel faint. Then she struck. She used an axe. Once the deed was done, she drained the blood into a basin. Later, in her written confession, she described what she did next. She threw the pieces into a pot, added 7 kilos of caustic soda, which I had bought to make soap, and stirred until everything dissolved into a thick, dark mush. When it had cooled, I poured it into molds and made soap. I gave the soap to neighbors and friends. The cakes, too, turned out well. I served them with tea. Faustina's savings were gone. Her letters were mailed, and no one ever looked for her. Leonarda's second victim was Francesca Soavi, a teacher who had recently lost her job. Leonarda promised her a new position at a girls' school in Piacenza. The same instructions, the same ritual, the same ending. This time, she wrote, "She ended up in the pot, like the first one. Her flesh was fat and white. When it had melted, I added a bottle of cologne, and after a long time of boiling, I made some of the most acceptable creamy soap. I gave bars to my friends. They all complimented me." Francesca's family never saw her again. Her third and final victim was Virginia Cacioppo, a former opera singer who had fallen on hard times. Leonarda promised her a job in Florence with a wealthy impresario. Virginia was excited, hopeful, and grateful. But when she stepped into Leonarda's house for a farewell drink, she met the same fate as the others. Leonarda later said, almost proudly, "She ended up in the pot like the other two. Her flesh was sweeter. When I added sugar, chocolate, and flour, I made the most delicious tea cakes. Everyone said how good they were. The soap, the tea cakes, the money,
all part of the same ritual, a sacrifice, she believed, to protect her beloved Giuseppe. But murder leaves stains that even soap cannot wash away. Virginia's sister grew suspicious when the letters stopped arriving. She went to the police and told them the last person who saw Virginia alive was Leonarda. When police arrived, Leonarda smiled warmly and invited them in. She was calm, too calm. But as they searched her house, the sweet smell of soap mixed with something foul. They found traces of blood, bone, and human fat.
Leonarda confessed immediately, not out of guilt, but pride. She claimed she had saved her son's life through her sacrifices. When police arrested Giuseppe, believing he might have been involved, Leonarda screamed, "Take me, not him! I did it all for love!" Her trial in 1946 became one of the most sensational in Italian history. Reporters filled the courtroom. Women whispered prayers. Men stared in horror. When the charges were read, Leonarda stood and calmly corrected the judge's details. She explained her methods step by step, as if teaching a recipe. Her tone was neither ashamed nor defensive, merely practical. She insisted she was not insane. She said she had done what any mother would do to protect her child. The court disagreed. She was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 30 years in prison and 3 years in a criminal asylum. The prophecy of her palm reading fulfilled to the letter. In prison, Leonarda became a model inmate. She cooked for others, sewed clothes, and offered fortune-telling to guards. She even wrote her own memoir, titled An Embittered Soul's Confessions. In it, she justified every act, claiming love, not hatred, had guided her hand. She died in 1970, aged 76, in the women's asylum of Pozzuoli. Her house in Correggio still stands, and to this day, the locals whisper about the smell of almonds that once drifted from its windows, the scent of poison and of sin disguised as love. Leonarda Cianciulli was not mad in the way we think of madness. She was logical, devoted, and disturbingly sincere. She didn't kill for money or for pleasure or even revenge. She killed to appease a curse, to protect the only person she believed mattered. That's what makes her story truly terrifying, because it blurs the line between love and lunacy, between devotion and damnation.
France, 1833. In the gentle countryside of Brittany, where fog rolls through the fields like a living ghost, a young servant girl began her work in the kitchens of priests, nobles, and families who would come to trust her more than they should. Her name was Hélène Gégadot, and to her neighbors she was a quiet, diligent maid, humble, pious, always ready with a curtsy and a prayer. But wherever Hélène went, people began to die, and for 20 years no one could understand why. She was born in 1803 in the small village of Pluhinec on the rugged coast of Brittany. Her childhood was steeped in superstition, a world where witches were still whispered about, and death was seen as the will of God. Her mother died when she was very young, and her father, distant and poor, sent her to live with relatives who treated her as a servant. By her early 20s, Hélène had already developed a reputation as a good worker, obedient, efficient, and discreet. Her cooking was praised, her devotion admired. But behind that plain face and polite demeanor hid something twisted, something that craved control. And in that age, a woman like her had only one tool powerful enough to wield unseen power: arsenic. Her first victims were holy men.
In 1833, she was employed in the presbytery of the village of Guernes. The priest there, Father François Ledrogo, had taken her in kindly. Within weeks, he fell ill. Sudden vomiting, unbearable cramps, fever. The local doctor diagnosed cholera, a common and terrifying disease at the time. Then the housekeeper fell ill. Then 2 visiting priests, all dead within a month. Hélène wept at their funerals. She prayed beside their coffins. And when the parish closed its doors, she simply moved on to another village, another kitchen, another family. Wherever she went, sickness followed. But in 19th century France, disease was constant. No one thought to suspect the maid who scrubbed the floors and whispered prayers over the dying.
Over the next decade, Hélène changed employers again and again. She worked for priests, widows, schoolmasters, and families across Brittany, never staying long, always leaving after a string of inexplicable deaths. Children, servants, entire households wiped out in weeks. And always she seemed so heartbroken, so devout. Some called her cursed. Others said she brought misfortune. But no one dared to accuse her outright. She was, after all, a poor woman. And in that era, the poor were not seen as dangerous. They were invisible. There's no clear count of how many people Hélène killed in those early years. Some records suggest 20, others 40. Later investigators would estimate up to 60 victims, an unimaginable number for a woman with no access to power, wealth, or influence. But Hélène did not kill for gain. She stole nothing from her victims. She didn't poison to inherit or to escape punishment. Her motive, if there was one, seemed to live entirely in the realm of the irrational, perhaps an obsession with death itself. In 1841, she was hired by a family named Perrin in the city of Rennes. Again, the pattern repeated. Meals prepared, people sickened, funerals arranged. But now whispers began to spread. Doctors noticed the strange consistency of her employer's deaths. One remarked that all her victims had the same symptoms: burning throats, convulsions, blackened lips. Arsenic, again. The sweet, silent powder. But still, no one acted. No one wanted to believe that the quiet maid who cleaned their table could also be their executioner. Then came her downfall, and it began, ironically, because she slowed down. In 1849, she found work in a respectable household in Rennes, that of Monsieur and Madame Plaisance. Within weeks, the mistress of the house fell violently ill and died. Hélène stayed on, as always, to help with the mourning. But when Madame Plaisance's sister visited and shared a meal prepared by Hélène, she too fell sick. Doctors were called. One of them, a man named Dr. Leroux, had seen this before, and this time he refused to accept coincidence. He demanded an autopsy. The results revealed unmistakable traces of arsenic. When police searched Hélène's belongings, they found small packets of white powder hidden in her apron. She claimed it was cleaning material. They tested it. It was poison. She was arrested immediately. The people of Rennes were shocked. The newspapers called her the devil's cook. But when she was interrogated, she remained calm, almost indifferent. She denied everything, insisting that she loved her employers like family. When the evidence was laid before her, the bodies, the poison, the timeline, she simply shrugged. It was as though she couldn't comprehend what she'd done. Or worse, she didn't care. Her trial in 1851 captivated France. Hundreds gathered to watch the proceedings. Servants whispered that she had made a pact with the devil. Lawyers argued that she was insane.
But the prosecutors saw method in her madness, a deliberate, repeating pattern spanning nearly 2 decades. When the verdict came, the courtroom trembled with murmurs. Helene Jagado was found guilty of 27 murders and sentenced to death by guillotine. On the morning of February 26, 1852, she was led from her cell to the square in Rennes. She wore a simple black dress and carried a crucifix. Witnesses said she looked serene, almost peaceful. She refused a priest's final confession, saying only, "I am ready. God will judge me." Moments later, the blade fell. The crowd gasped, then fell silent. A chapter of invisible horror had ended. For years afterward, her story was half forgotten, buried beneath the noise of wars and revolutions. But her case left an eerie mark on French criminology, because Helene Jagado's killings predated the idea of a serial killer. There was no term for what she had done, no pattern to compare, no framework to understand a woman who killed for no reason other than the act itself.
Some modern psychologists believe she suffered from a form of psychogenic compulsion, a pathological drive to destroy what she served. Others think she was consumed by superstition, believing she was somehow freeing souls from earthly suffering. But we'll never know. She left no diaries, no letters, no justification, only death. In the quiet villages of Brittany, old stories still whisper about her. They say her ghost lingers in kitchens, stirring invisible pots. They say the scent of almonds, the smell of arsenic, is her calling card. And they say that when a servant prays too quietly for the souls of the dead, you should listen closely, because sometimes the prayer is not for forgiveness, it's for satisfaction. Helene Jagado was forgotten for a century, overshadowed by the male murderers who followed. But when her story resurfaced, historians realized she may have been one of the most prolific killers in recorded history. A woman who poisoned without motive, who moved from home to home, leaving death behind, and who smiled through it all. Her legacy is a chilling reminder that evil can thrive anywhere, even in the gentle hands that serve your supper. Paris, 1839. The age of elegance, of silk gloves and candlelit salons. A world obsessed with appearances, where women were measured not by truth, but by refinement, virtue, and charm. And in that glittering world, one woman dared to poison it from within. Her name was Marie Lafarge. She was beautiful, educated, cultured, everything a proper French lady was expected to be. But beneath her calm smile, ambition pulsed like venom. And soon, that ambition would lead her to the gallows of history. Marie Capelle was born in 1816 into a fading branch of the French aristocracy. Her father, an officer in Napoleon's army, died when she was young. Her mother married again, and Marie was sent to a convent, where she learned music, literature, and etiquette, but also a burning resentment toward poverty. She wanted to live like the women she saw in novels, in wealth, in beauty, and admiration. By her early 20s, she was charming, graceful, and more importantly, desperate. Her dowry was modest. Her family's name was her only currency. And so her relatives arranged a marriage, as was custom, to a man she had never met. His name was Charles Lafarge. When Marie first met Charles, she fainted, literally, because the man who arrived at her doorstep was not the dashing gentleman she had imagined, but a rough, awkward provincial ironmaster,
owner of a failing foundry in the bleak countryside of Corrèze. His clothes were dirty, his manners clumsy, his fortune far smaller than advertised. To a woman raised in salons and soft music, it was a nightmare. Still, she married him. She had no choice. But from the first day in the gray, cold mansion of Glandier, Marie Lafarge despised her husband. She wrote in her diary, "I have been sold. My life is buried in this tomb." Charles, oblivious to her disgust, adored her. He showered her with gifts, attention, and trust. But that trust would become his undoing. Soon after the wedding, Charles left for Paris on business. He wanted to improve the family foundry and asked Marie to write to him. Her letters were affectionate, even loving. Perhaps the first and last time she played the role of devoted wife. While he was gone, she spent her days exploring his accounts, his possessions, and his secrets. Then quietly, she began ordering small amounts of arsenic from the local chemist. She said it was for keeping rats away. The chemist believed her. After all, Madame Lafarge was polite, soft-spoken, well-mannered. When Charles returned home, he fell violently ill. Marie nursed him tenderly, spooning him broth and medicine, but his condition worsened after every meal she prepared. Vomiting, burning throat, stomach pain, cold sweats, the same pattern over and over. Neighbors began to whisper. The servants were terrified. One of them, a girl named Rosalie, noticed the white powder Marie mixed into her husband's food. When she confronted her, she snapped, "It's sugar, and you will say nothing if you value your job." But Rosalie said something. She told the priest. The priest told the doctor, and the doctor told the police.
When Charles finally died in January 1840, he was 33. Marie, dressed in black lace, wept at his funeral and fainted at the graveside, the perfect widow. But before the ground could even settle, investigators ordered his body exhumed. And there, in that cold corpse, they found what would become one of the first great triumphs of modern forensic science: traces of arsenic, unmistakable, deadly, deliberate. The examination was conducted by none other than Mathieu Orfila, the father of modern toxicology. Using chemical tests never before employed in court, he proved beyond doubt that Charles Lafarge had been poisoned. The evidence was revolutionary, and it destroyed Marie's carefully crafted image. Her letters were seized, letters to her husband full of sudden affection, written just as the poison began to take hold. Her behavior was dissected, her motives debated. Why had she done it? Was it for money? For freedom? For revenge against the life she despised? No one could say for certain. Perhaps not even Marie herself. Her trial, held in the small town of Toul, became a national spectacle. Reporters traveled from Paris. Crowds filled the courtroom, eager to glimpse the woman who had turned marriage into murder. She arrived in black silk, pale and composed, her beauty undimmed by scandal. When the charges were read, she fainted, as she always did when the moment required sympathy. The defense painted her as a victim of circumstance, a fragile woman trapped in an unhappy marriage. The prosecution painted her as a serpent, charming, deceitful, and deadly. When Orfila took the stand to present his toxicology report, the courtroom gasped. It was the first time science, not speculation, condemned a murderer. After 9 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. Guilty. Marie Lafarge was sentenced to life imprisonment with hard labor.
They sent her to the grim prison of Montpellier. Gone were the silks, the mirrors, the perfumed letters. Her hands, once soft and white, became raw from work. Yet even in prison, she maintained her innocence. She wrote books, poetry, and letters to friends in Paris, some of whom still believed her story.
Her health declined rapidly. Tuberculosis hollowed her body, and though she begged for a pardon, it was not granted until 1852, when she was already dying. She spent her final days in a convent hospital, still claiming, "I am guilty only of loving too much." She died at 36, alone. Marie Lafarge's case changed history. Her conviction was the first to rely heavily on chemical analysis, establishing forensic toxicology as a science that could speak for the dead. But it also revealed something deeper about the time she lived in, how society viewed women, emotion, and deception. In the newspapers, she was called the beautiful poisoner, the graceful monster, the tragic widow. The public couldn't decide whether to pity her or hate her. Some saw her as a victim of male betrayal, others as the ultimate manipulator. But the fascination endured. For decades after her death, plays and novels romanticized her story. Writers called her the French Lady Macbeth. Painters depicted her gazing mournfully from her prison cell, still lovely, still damned. But history has no romance for poison. It is silent, colorless, and final. In the end, Marie Lafarge was neither heroine nor martyr. She was a woman who thought she could twist her fate by twisting the truth, and who discovered that arsenic kills more than bodies. It kills illusions. It strips away every mask until only the cold reflection of guilt remains. Victorian England, a time of empire, invention, and moral virtue, or at least the illusion of it. The streets of London were crowded with wealth and misery, side by side. Gilded carriages rolled past starving children. Factories churned smoke into the sky, while mothers begged in the alleys for bread. And in that world of hypocrisy and hardship, one woman made a living from society's shame. She promised salvation to the desperate. She promised care, compassion, and discretion. But behind her calm face and tidy home, she built an empire of death. Her name was Amelia Dyer, and she was the most prolific baby killer in British history.
She was born in 1837 in the small town of Pile Marsh near Bristol. Her father was a master shoemaker, strict, proud, and often cold. Her mother, Sarah, suffered from mental illness, believed to be brought on by typhus. As a child, Amelia watched her mother's mind unravel, the screams, the delusions, the violence. When Sarah died, Amelia was barely 11, and the child who grew up amid that madness would learn to hide her emotions well. She trained as an apprentice dressmaker, then as a nurse. She was quiet, polite, disciplined, the kind of woman Victorians trusted. But something inside her had hardened. She saw too much death in her work, infants who didn't survive, women who died in childbirth, poor families who gave their babies away because they simply couldn't feed them. It was a cruel time for the poor, and for unmarried women, cruelty turned to torment. An unmarried pregnancy in the 1800s was a social death sentence. Fathers disowned daughters,
employers fired them. And the poorhouses, grim, disease-ridden prisons for the destitute, were their only refuge. That's where baby farming began. It was a dark trade, hidden beneath a layer of respectability. Women like Amelia Dyer advertised in newspapers. Nurse willing to adopt a baby, good home, loving care, small fee required. Desperate mothers paid them to take the child, sometimes for temporary fostering, sometimes for adoption. Once the money was exchanged, the mother walked away, relieved, ashamed, and believing her child would be safe. But often, that child never lived to see another sunrise. At first, Amelia Dyer followed the pattern of her time. She took in infants, claimed to find them new homes, and collected her fees. But soon, the fees became smaller, the work harder, and her patience thinner. Babies cried. They needed food, medicine, attention, all of which cost money. And so she found a quicker, easier way. When the babies arrived, Amelia would soothe them. A lullaby, a soft touch, a bottle of milk laced with laudanum, a powerful opiate. It made them quiet, too quiet. And then she would tighten a piece of white dress tape, her signature method, around their tiny necks until they stopped breathing. It was fast, silent, and profitable.
Once the child was dead, she wrapped the body in cloth and disposed of it, sometimes in the river, sometimes under floorboards, sometimes buried in shallow graves. There was no record, no trace, no questions. After all, in the shadows of Victorian England, the lives of poor children were worth less than the candles that lit their deaths. Over the years, Amelia moved from town to town, Bristol, Reading, Caversham, Kensington, always under new names, always with new advertisements. Each time the law grew suspicious, she simply reinvented herself. She used aliases like Mrs. Harding, Mrs. Smith, Mrs. Thomas. She spent short stints in prison for neglect or minor fraud, but was never connected to murder. Each time she was released, she returned to her trade, colder, smarter, deadlier. Her business grew into something almost mechanical. Mothers would hand her their babies in tears. She'd smile, promise love and care, take the payment, and within hours, the child would be gone. At one point, she was believed to have killed up to 400 infants. 400 tiny lives erased by the hands that claimed to protect them. Her crimes might have continued indefinitely, if not for the river. In March 1896, a bargeman on the River Thames near Reading spotted a small parcel floating by the bank. Curious, he pulled it from the water. It was wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Inside was the body of a baby girl. And on that paper, faint but legible, was a name and address, a clue Amelia had overlooked. The police traced it to her lodging house. When they arrived, they found the stench of death thick in the air. The rooms were filled with baby clothes, letters from mothers, bottles of laudanum, and spools of white tape. Her past was written in those walls. Hundreds of desperate women, hundreds of vanished infants. When she was arrested, Amelia Dyer confessed with a chilling composure. "You'll know all mine by the tape around their necks," she said. During interrogation, she spoke with a strange detachment, neither insane nor remorseful, simply matter of fact. When asked why she did it, she said, "It was quick. They didn't suffer. They went to sleep." Her trial in June 1896 drew national attention. The courtroom was filled with journalists, social reformers, and grieving mothers who had once placed their trust and their children in her hands. The evidence was overwhelming. Letters, witness statements, the river bodies, the tape, the laudanum. She was found guilty of murder after a single day's deliberation. When the judge asked if she had anything to say before sentencing, Amelia simply nodded and murmured, "I have nothing."
On June 10th, 1896, Amelia Dyer was executed by hanging at Newgate Prison. She was 59 years old. The newspapers called her the Ogress of Reading. She showed no emotion as she walked to the gallows. The prison chaplain whispered prayers, and then, with a single movement, the trapdoor opened, ending the life of the woman who had ended so many others. Her case horrified the nation. It forced England to confront its hidden cruelty, the exploitation of poor women, the indifference toward unwanted children, the cracks in a society that preached morality but practiced neglect. Within a few years, new laws were passed to regulate adoption and childcare, closing the loopholes that had allowed baby farming to exist. But it came too late for those hundreds of tiny souls, lost to the greed and emptiness of one woman's heart. Amelia Dyer wasn't insane. She wasn't even particularly cruel in appearance. She was simply practical, in the most monstrous way possible. She saw a system that didn't value life and decided to profit from it. Her evil wasn't born of rage or jealousy, but of cold calculation, the kind of evil that thrives when the world stops looking. Her story remains one of the darkest in British history, a chilling reminder that horror often hides behind normality, behind lace curtains and polite smiles, behind the promise of care. And sometimes it hides behind the lullaby of a woman who tells a crying child, "Hush, little one, everything will be all right." India, 1840. The sun was merciless. Dust clung to the skin like second breath, and the scent of sandalwood mixed with sweat and death. The British Raj had extended its iron fingers across the subcontinent, but even the empire couldn't control the ancient roads, those long, lonely paths that cut through jungles and deserts, where caravans vanished without a trace. And along those roads, under the name of faith and fate, worked the Thuggee, India's infamous cult of stranglers. They were men of shadows, devotees of the goddess Kali, who believed that murder was not a sin, but a sacred offering. But among them, hidden in legend and whisper, was a woman, a widow who turned piety into power. Her name was Sita Devi, and she would become known as the Holy Widow of Death. She was born around 1825 in the northern plains of India, near what is now Uttar Pradesh. A small village girl, married off before she turned 12, as was the custom. Her husband, a merchant, died young, leaving her widowed by 16. In a culture that revered purity but punished widowhood, she became untouchable, a living ghost. Her head was shaved, her jewelry stripped, her life confined to silence. But Sita Devi refused to disappear. She saw in widowhood not weakness, but opportunity. She learned to move through towns unnoticed, the quiet woman in white, the one no man dared to touch. And slowly, she built her own circle of servants, beggars, travelers, and men who would kill at her command. Her power began with devotion. She called herself a Bhakt of Kali, the goddess of destruction and renewal. She would gather followers beneath a banyan tree and speak softly of destiny, of divine will, of the cycle of death and rebirth. They listened, entranced.
In a world where famine and plague took lives daily, death didn't frighten them anymore. It simply changed shape. Sita claimed that Kali had chosen her to balance the scales, to kill not in anger, but in worship. And so, under her gentle instruction, she taught the art of thugi, the sacred strangulation ritual using a rumal, a silken scarf twisted around the neck. She told her followers, "A true devotee kills without hatred. The breath you take is not yours, it belongs to Kali." And in her presence, murder became a form of prayer. The thugi cult had existed for centuries, mostly as bands of robbers who preyed on travelers under religious pretense. But Sita Devi's group was different. She didn't roam the roads at night like her male counterparts. She built a facade, a place of refuge. She posed as a holy widow who offered food and shelter to pilgrims and traders. Those who came to her house seeking blessings never left.
Witnesses later described her charm as disarming. She was small, soft-spoken, her eyes filled with sorrow. To the British officers who later hunted her, she seemed incapable of harm, but the villagers knew. They whispered that she walked with shadows, that her prayers were answered too quickly, that her well never ran dry, even in drought. Inside her courtyard, rituals took place in silence. Guests were seated, offered sweet milk or betel leaf. When the signal came, a faint cough, a word like "Devi," her assistants would slip behind the victims, the silken scarves looping over their necks. A prayer was murmured, then a single pull. It was quick, efficient, and according to Sita, blessed. When the British colonial police began documenting the thugi networks in the 1830s and 40s, they were shocked by the sheer scale. Hundreds of bands across India, thousands of murders. But they had never imagined a woman could lead them. Sita Devi became a ghost in their reports, spoken of but never seen. They called her the widow priestess. She moved constantly, traveling with small groups, disguised as a holy woman or healer. By some estimates, she may have been responsible, directly or indirectly, for the deaths of over 150 travelers along the northern trade routes. Her victims were usually men, merchants, pilgrims, wandering ascetics. Their bodies were buried in dry riverbeds, were burned as part of ritual offerings. Their possessions were redistributed among her followers. To them, she was a saint. But every saint leaves traces, and for the British, every trace was a clue. In 1849, a captured thugi named Pola Ram broke under interrogation. He confessed not only to dozens of murders, but also to following a woman in white blessed by the Mother of Death. He described her eyes like calm fire, and her voice like prayer and poison mixed. He led officers to a village near Kanpur, where they found a well filled with bones. At the bottom lay jewelry, clothes, and fragments of silken scarves. The villagers said they belonged to Sita Devi's pilgrims.
When she was finally captured, she didn't resist. She was found sitting in the shade of a banyan tree, reciting mantras, her hands stained with turmeric and ash. The British officers approached her cautiously, half terrified, half fascinated. She looked at them and smiled. "You come for me?" she said softly. "Then Kali has finished with me." At her trial in 1850, translators struggled to convey her composure. She spoke in riddles, mixing religion and reason, insisting she had merely freed the souls chosen by the goddess. When shown evidence of the murders, she folded her hands and said, "The body dies. The spirit is reborn. What crime is that?"
Her words chilled the court. The British sentenced her to death by hanging, but Indian officials requested clemency. She was, after all, a woman and considered mad with devotion. The compromise was life imprisonment in the fort prison at Lucknow. For years she remained there, a curiosity of empire. Missionaries visited her, trying to convert her. She smiled and recited prayers to Kali. Doctors studied her calm indifference. Guards feared her, claiming that snakes gathered near her cell at night. When she died in 1874, the British records listed her as unknown native female, age 49, cause of death, fever. But among the prisoners, the whispers said something different, that the walls of her cell were covered in handprints made of ash, and that on the night she died, the air smelled faintly of flowers and fire. Sita Devi vanished from colonial history, buried beneath the stories of male Thutti leaders. But oral legends kept her name alive, the widow who served the goddess through death, who defied men and gods alike. Some call her mad, others call her a martyr. Yet one truth remains. She was one of the few women in history to command a cult of killers, not through fear, but through faith. Her hands may have been small, but her shadow stretched across empires. The holy widow of death remains a paradox, part saint, part sinner, part myth. In her story we see the terrifying union of belief and blood, of devotion twisted into destruction. And perhaps that is the most haunting lesson of all, that faith, when blinded by desperation, can sanctify even the darkest acts.
Midwestern America. Flat land, stretching forever. Fields that whisper when the wind passes through them, and houses built with hard work and hope. This was the land of new beginnings, where immigrants came to start fresh, where dreams could take root in the soil. But sometimes, that soil hides bones. In LaPorte, Indiana, around the year 1900, stood a white farmhouse on McClung Road. It looked ordinary enough. 2 stories, red barn, apple trees in the yard. But locals called it Murder Farm, because inside that house lived a woman named Belle Gunness, and under its ground lay the remains of men who had once called her my love. She was born Brynhild Paulsdottir Storseth in 1859 in the rural village of Selbu, Norway. Her family was poor, farm laborers with more mouths than they could feed. Even as a child, Belle was large, strong, and ambitious. She envied the rich families in her town and swore she'd one day live like them. Her life took a dark turn when, at 17, she became pregnant after a local man's assault. When he refused to marry her, she was shamed, mocked, and left destitute. Weeks later, he fell mysteriously ill and died. The villagers called it coincidence, but later, after Belle's story unfolded, they remembered that death differently. At 21, she sailed for America, a new land, a new name, a new start. She became Belle Gunness, and America would come to regret ever welcoming her. She married her first husband, Mads Sorensen, in Chicago. They opened a small candy store, but it failed quickly. Then the shop caught fire. The insurance money saved them. A pattern was born. When their home later burned down, another insurance payout followed. And when Mads died unexpectedly in 1900, on the very day that 2 overlapping life insurance policies were active, Belle collected both. The doctors said it was heart failure, but one of them whispered another word, strychnine. Belle didn't wait for gossip. She sold everything, moved to LaPorte, Indiana, and bought herself a farmhouse. Acres of land, barns, animals, and all the space she needed for her next chapter.
Her neighbors liked her at first. A hard-working widow, good with her animals, friendly but reserved. She hired farmhands, mostly men, who didn't stay long. They said she had a temper, and that when she looked at you, it was as if she were measuring how much you were worth. Then came Peter Gunness, another Norwegian immigrant. He was quiet, kind, and widowed too. They married within a few months. 1 week after the wedding, his infant daughter died while in Belle's care. Then, only 8 months later, Peter himself was dead. A heavy sausage grinder accidentally fell from a shelf and crushed his skull. The coroner said the story didn't make sense. Neighbors whispered, but Belle played the part of the grieving widow perfectly. When questioned, she said softly, "It was God's will. Tragedy seems to follow me." And once again, she collected the insurance. But Belle wasn't finished. She was clever. She knew that insurance fraud would only take her so far. So she found a new source of income. Lonely Hearts. She began placing ads in Norwegian-language newspapers across the Midwest. Her words were simple, charming, irresistible. Comely widow who owns large farm in Indiana desires to make the acquaintance of a gentleman with similar interests. Object? Matrimony. Responses flooded in. Farmers, laborers, widowers, men with savings and loneliness in equal measure. They wrote her letters filled with dreams of love and comfort. She wrote back with warmth, inviting them to bring their savings, their jewelry, their hearts. "Come," she'd say, "let us start a new life together." And when they came, she welcomed them with open arms and buried them by morning. Her method was simple. When the men arrived, she'd serve them dinner and strong coffee. Sometimes she'd show them her farm, the livestock, the fields. Then, sometime in the night, a single blow to the head with a meat cleaver or hammer. The body was dragged to the basement, dismembered and buried in the pig pen. The pigs devoured what was left. Neighbors noticed that her suitors always seemed to move on quickly, never writing home again. Belle explained it easily. "They left," she'd say. "They weren't what I hoped." No one questioned her. She was respectable, polite, a good churchwoman.
The pattern continued for years. Dozens of men came and vanished. Each brought money, often thousands of dollars, life savings meant for their future with her. She took it all, then took their lives. One farmhand, Ray Lamfair, fell deeply in love with her. He worked for her, worshipped her, and helped her bury the bodies. But when he became jealous of her gentleman callers, Belle dismissed him. He began to drink, to talk too much. Soon, the whole town whispered. In 1908, everything unraveled. One morning, the farmhouse of Belle Gunness went up in flames. The fire burned fast and hot, leaving only the foundation. Inside the ruins, police found 4 bodies, 3 children, and the decapitated body of a woman. They assumed it was Belle, but the head was missing, and the body was much smaller than hers. Ray Lamfair was arrested and accused of arson and murder. He swore Belle was alive, that she had set the fire herself and vanished. The police laughed, until they began to dig. Behind the farmhouse, in the soft earth of the pig pen, they found bones, then more bones, then entire skeletons. Men, women, children. Some identified, most not. In total, at least 12 bodies were confirmed, but investigators suspected over 40 victims. Among them were her many suitors, men who had traveled hundreds of miles, to meet their Norwegian bride. Each one ended in the same graveyard of pigs and secrets. The townspeople were horrified. LaPorte became a circus of reporters and gawkers. Detectives from Chicago and New York arrived, digging up the yard like archaeologists of sin. Belle Gunness became a legend overnight, the Lady Bluebeard of Indiana. Her face appeared on newspaper covers nationwide, and yet no one could prove she was dead. The body in the ruins didn't match. The autopsy revealed that the woman's stomach was smaller, her bones more delicate. Some said it was a housekeeper or drifter. Others swore Belle had faked her death, fled with her money, and started again somewhere far away. Over the years, sightings poured in California, in Chicago, even in New York, but none were ever confirmed. Belle Gunness had become a ghost that wore many faces.
Ray Lamphere was convicted of arson, but not murder. He died in prison soon after, of pneumonia. Before his death, he confessed to helping Belle bury the bodies, but insisted she had escaped that night. He said she lured a housekeeper to her home, killed her, placed her body in the bed, set the fire, and disappeared into the dark with her cash and jewels. No one knows if it was true. To this day, her body has never been conclusively identified. Belle Gunness remains one of America's greatest criminal mysteries, a woman who used love as bait and trust as a weapon. She was a pioneer of calculated evil, methodical, practical, efficient. Her killings weren't impulsive, they were business. And perhaps that's what makes her story so terrifying. She didn't kill for rage or pleasure, but because it was convenient. Men came to her for comfort, and she gave them eternity. Today, the site of her farm is gone, reclaimed by nature. But locals still say that on certain nights, when the wind is just right, you can smell something sweet and metallic in the air, and hear the sound of pigs grunting, restless, as if remembering what they once fed upon. And somewhere out there, perhaps, Belle Gunness still smiles. Because you can fake many things in life, a marriage, a death, even a legend. But evil never truly dies. Tokyo, 1948. The city was broken. The war had ended, but its ghosts still wandered the ruins. Streets were filled with orphans, mothers with hollow eyes, fathers searching through rubble for anything they could sell. Japan was rebuilding, but for the poor, there was nothing left to rebuild. It was in this landscape of hunger and hopelessness that a quiet woman became known as the demon midwife. Her name was Miyuki Ishikawa, and she killed not for pleasure, not for money, but she said, out of mercy. Her story is not one of rage, but of ruin, a tragedy turned inside out, where compassion became cruelty and care became death. Miyuki was born in 1897 in Kunitomi, a small village in Miyazaki Prefecture. She was intelligent, ambitious, and determined to rise above her humble origins. She trained as a midwife, one of the most respected professions for women at the time, a guardian of life and health. To her patients, she was calm, capable, and kind. When she married, she and her husband Takeshi moved to Tokyo, where Miyuki eventually became the director of a maternity home called the Kotobuki Sanin, or the House of Happiness. It was a place for the poor, a safe refuge for unwed mothers, abandoned wives, and families who couldn't afford hospital care. In a city shattered by war, such places were lifelines, but they were also forgotten by the government. And in the silence of that neglect, horror took root. By 1945, the maternity home was overflowing. Mothers came with newborns they couldn't feed, couldn't clothe, couldn't keep. Food was scarce, jobs were gone, and social stigma was merciless. Unwed mothers were outcasts. Children born out of wedlock had no legal identity, no protection. Some mothers begged Miyuki to find adoptive families. Others left their babies on her doorstep, unable to face them. At first, she tried to help,
arranging adoptions, pleading with charities, writing letters to authorities. But the answers were always the same. No funds, no space, no help. And something in Miyuki began to break. She started to believe that saving the babies from starvation, from abandonment, from a slow, cruel death, meant ending their lives quickly, mercifully. She convinced herself that killing them was kinder than letting them suffer, that in death they would be free from hunger, from shame, from the cold indifference of a society that had already killed their futures. At first, she acted alone. A quiet hand, a soft whisper, a pillow pressed over a face that never learned to cry. Then another, and another. The bodies were hidden in back rooms, then handed over to her husband, who took them away to be buried or burned. It became routine, a process, a mercy. But mercy has a way of turning monstrous when it's repeated. Soon she stopped waiting for mothers to ask. She decided for them. Babies she deemed hopeless cases, unwanted, illegitimate, too sick, too poor, were killed without hesitation. Her logic was cold, clinical, unshaken. She wasn't murdering them, she said later. She was releasing them. To those around her, Miyuki still seemed calm, even saintly. She dressed in white, moved softly through the halls, spoke in gentle tones. The nurses obeyed her. The mothers trusted her. No one imagined that behind her composed face was a ledger of death, an ever-growing list of tiny lives extinguished before they began. As the years passed, rumors began to spread. Neighbors noticed strange smells from the incinerator behind the maternity home. Others saw small bundles being carried out at night. But in post-war Tokyo, people minded their own pain. Everyone was guilty of something: theft, ration fraud, black market trading. Who would accuse a midwife trying to help the poor? Then in early 1948, two men made a grisly discovery. They were police officers investigating an unrelated case when they found the bodies of 5 infants wrapped in cloth, abandoned in an old building. An autopsy revealed no signs of disease. The cause of death? Deliberate neglect or suffocation. The trail led to the Kotobuki maternity home and to Miyuki Ishikawa. When police searched the premises, what they found defied comprehension. Bodies, tiny, mummified, decaying, hidden in closets, buried beneath floors, piled in storerooms. Some had been kept for months. Some were only days old. By the time the investigation ended, over 40 infant corpses were recovered, and authorities believed the true number of victims exceeded 100, perhaps even 200. Miyuki was arrested alongside her husband and a local doctor, Shiro Nakayama, who had been signing false death certificates to conceal the crimes. When interrogated, Miyuki didn't weep, didn't deny. She spoke with calm conviction. "They were unwanted," she said. "I did not kill them. Society did. I only helped them escape." Her words sent shockwaves through Japan. The newspapers dubbed her the demon midwife. Public opinion was divided. Some saw her as pure evil, a monster who betrayed her duty to protect life. Others saw her as a tragic reflection of a nation's failure, a woman crushed by a broken system, doing what she thought necessary. During her trial, the defense argued that poverty and desperation had driven her to madness. The prosecution argued that she had played God. She showed no remorse. She maintained her quiet, detached composure throughout. In 1952, she was convicted of manslaughter, not murder, due to the ambiguity of Japan's post-war laws regarding infanticide and parental consent. Her sentence?
8 years in prison. 8 years for hundreds of deaths. She served her time quietly and was released early for good behavior. After that, she disappeared from public record. Her later life unknown, her death unrecorded. Some said she returned to the countryside and lived as a midwife again, this time for living children. Others said she lived in seclusion, haunted by ghosts only she could hear. But in the neighborhoods around her old maternity home, people whispered that she still walked at night, a white figure drifting between houses, humming lullabies to children who would never wake.
Miyuki Ishikawa's story remains one of Japan's darkest taboos. She killed not for wealth, not for hatred, but for what she believed was mercy, and that makes her evil all the more unsettling. She wasn't a sadist, she wasn't insane, she was practical. A woman who decided that death was kinder than poverty, that silence was better than suffering. And perhaps that's what makes her legacy so terrifying, because her crimes were born not from chaos, but from logic, from a twisted sense of care that mirrored society's own neglect. When people remember her, they don't think of blood or screams. They think of the quiet, the stillness of a room where a newborn's cry never comes, the echo of footsteps fading down a hall, and the soft, calm voice of a midwife saying, "Rest now. It's better this way." Germany, 1813. The city of Bremen was still trembling from war. Napoleon's army had marched through, leaving hunger, sickness, and silence behind. But amid the ruins, a woman with golden hair walked through the streets carrying soup for the sick and bread for the hungry. She smiled, prayed, and whispered words of comfort to the dying. They called her the Angel of Bremen. But angels do not carry poison in their aprons. And this one, Gesche Gottfried, carried death wherever she went. Gesche was born Gesche Margarita Timm in 1875 into a modest tailor's family in Bremen. Her childhood was unremarkable, quiet, proper, obedient. She was raised to be a good wife, a good mother, a good Christian. And in time, she was all of those things. At 21, she married Johann Miltenberg, a saddler with steady work and a fondness for drink. They had 3 children together. Their life was simple, poor, but manageable. Yet Gesche was not content. Her husband's temper soured, his debts grew, and his affection faded. And somewhere in the loneliness of her domestic life, she began to taste bitterness, not toward him alone, but toward the entire world that had confined her. One evening, Johann fell ill. He complained of stomach pain, vomiting, and convulsions. The local doctor suspected cholera. Gesche nursed him tenderly, praying by his bedside, spooning him broth. Within days, he was dead. She wept at the funeral, her children clinging to her skirts. The neighbors pitied her, a young widow left to raise 3 children alone in a city ravaged by war. They brought her food, offered small sums of money, and praised her strength. No one suspected that the same hands that wiped her husband's brow had laced his food with arsenic, a white powder known locally as mouse butter. It had become her secret companion. At first, she claimed the poison was for rats, a simple household precaution. But soon she began using it on people who annoyed her, a neighbor who gossiped, a friend who criticized, a lover who grew too demanding. She'd serve them soup or coffee, sit by them as they grew sick, and pray for their souls as they died. To the world, she remained a symbol of kindness, a saint, an angel. No one questioned how death always seemed to follow her. When her parents fell ill, she was there to help. Both died within weeks.
her twin brother Johann soon after, then her close friend Anna, then her fiancé Paul Thomas Zimmermann, who had promised her marriage and comfort. He died too, after complaining of strange pains in his stomach. Each death brought her sympathy, sometimes inheritance, and always admiration. She became known for her devotion to the sick, the woman who appeared whenever someone needed help, the compassionate nurse who never turned away from suffering. But what no one realized was that she was creating that suffering herself. Her crimes continued for 15 years. By the 1820s, she had killed her parents, her brother, her children, her friends, her lovers, and countless others. At least 15 confirmed victims, though some believe the number was closer to 30. Each death followed the same pattern: sudden illness, violent spasms, a gradual decline, and then death, all under Gescha's loving care. And each time, she wept beautifully. She was a master of grief, her tears so convincing that even doctors pitied her. In a time before forensic science, arsenic was the perfect weapon. It mimicked natural diseases. It left no smell, no taste, and little trace. Only when her victims' eyes grew glassy and their skin turned pale did anyone suspect something unnatural. But by then, it was far too late.
The illusion began to crack in 1828. Gescha had poisoned a friend, Johann Rumpf, who had grown suspicious of her. He survived the first attempt. When he realized his symptoms worsened only after visiting her, he confronted the authorities. Police began quietly investigating, exhuming several of her former victims. Inside their remains, they found traces of arsenic. Unmistakable, fatal. When officers came to arrest her, Gescha didn't struggle. She looked at them calmly and said, "At last, I was tired." Her confession was shocking, not just for its detail, but for its serenity. She listed her victims one by one, describing their final hours with the detached precision of a nurse reading her notes. She said she had started with her husband because he was cruel, and continued because it became easy. She claimed she had no hatred for her victims, only weariness, only the strange relief that came after watching someone slip away. When asked why she poisoned her own children, her eyes filled with tears. "I could not bear their suffering," she said, "nor my own." To her, death was not evil. It was liberation. Her trial drew crowds from across Germany. People couldn't reconcile the woman before them, modest, soft-spoken, pale, with the monstrous crimes she had confessed. Newspapers called her the Angel of Death and the Black Widow of Hanover. Priests visited her in prison trying to stir repentance, but she remained eerily calm. The city of Bremen had never seen anything like it. For months she was kept in solitary confinement, allowed only a Bible and a candle. She read every day. She prayed, and she waited. On April 21, 1831, Gescha Gottfried was led to the public square outside the cathedral. Thousands gathered to witness the execution, men, women, even children perched on rooftops. It was the last public execution in Bremen's history. She climbed the scaffold without a word. The executioner asked if she wished to pray. She nodded, murmured a final psalm, and then laid her head upon the block. The blade fell. The crowd gasped, and the Angel of Bremen was no more.
After her death, the people of Bremen refused to forget her. Some feared her ghost, others pitied her soul. In the years that followed, stories spread that her spirit haunted the alleyways, that her soft voice could still be heard offering tea to travelers. And in the very square where she was executed,
the city placed a small, discreet mark, a spookstein, or spitting stone, embedded in the cobblestone. Even today, locals spit on it as they pass, not out of hatred, but as a ritual, to keep her curse from returning. Gesche Gottfried's story remains one of Europe's most unsettling portraits of evil disguised as virtue. She was not driven by greed or rage, but by a need to feel power, the power to heal and to destroy, to give life and take it away. To the world, she was mercy incarnate. To her victims, she was the silent poison that crept through every meal, every touch, every act of care. And perhaps that's what makes her unforgettable, because the most terrifying killers are not those who look like monsters, but those who look like angels. Sweden, 1889. A country on the edge of modernity. Electric lights were beginning to glow in city windows. The railways snaked across the land. And yet, in the rural villages, time still moved to the rhythm of the seasons, slow, hard, unchanging. In those quiet places, gossip traveled faster than trains, and when the gossip turned to blood, it never stopped. This is the story of Anna Månsdotter, the woman who became known as the Yingzhou murderess, the last woman ever executed in Sweden. Anna was born in 1840 in a small village in southern Sweden, a region of farmland, superstition, and silence. Her family was poor but respectable. She grew up working in the fields, her hands hardened by frost and labor. When she was 20, she married Nils Nilsson, a fisherman, and together they had one child, a son named Per Nilsson. Per was everything to her. Her husband was distant and cold, but her son was warmth. From the moment he could walk, she kept him close, perhaps too close. Neighbors whispered that she spoiled him, that she let him sleep beside her even as he grew older. But in the villages of old Sweden, families were small, houses smaller. No one spoke too loudly about such things. When Nils died, Anna and Per were left alone, and that's when the bond between mother and son began to darken. By the time Per reached adulthood, their relationship had become something no one dared to name. They lived together, worked together, and never separated. Anna saw herself not as a mother anymore, but as the only woman who truly understood him. When Per began to look at other women, jealousy took root. Slow, silent, poisonous. In 1887, Per was persuaded by local elders to marry a young woman named Hanna Johansdotter, the daughter of a nearby farmer. She was kind, pretty, and devout, everything a proper Swedish wife should be. The village celebrated their marriage, but Anna did not smile at the wedding. She stood apart, watching her son kiss another woman. Her hands were clenched so tightly that her knuckles went white. After the marriage, Hanna moved into the small cottage that Anna and Per shared. From the beginning, the atmosphere was unbearable. Anna resented her new daughter-in-law's presence, her youth, her place in Per's bed. She criticized everything Hanna did, the way she cooked, the way she cleaned, the way she spoke. Per, weak and easily dominated, sided with his mother. Soon the house turned cold with unspoken hatred. Within weeks, Anna began whispering to her son strange things, cruel things. She told him that Hanna didn't love him, that she was unfaithful, that she mocked him behind his back, and slowly she convinced him that Hanna had to go. On the night of March 28, 1889, the snow lay thick on the ground outside their cottage. Inside, the lamp burned low.
Anna waited until Hanna had gone to bed, then woke Per. Together they entered the small room where Hanna slept. What happened next would horrify all of Sweden. Anna threw herself on Hanna, holding her down. Per hesitated, trembling, confused, terrified, until Anna hissed, "Do it, my son, end it." He obeyed. He strangled his young wife while his mother held her. When it was done, Anna helped him arrange the body, combed Hanna's hair, and placed her hands neatly across her chest. They claimed she had hanged herself, an accident of despair. But their story was already unraveling. The neighbors noticed the bruises. The priest who came to bless the body saw the marks of fingers around the neck, not a rope. And when he asked Per questions, the boy broke down. Within hours, both mother and son were arrested.
The investigation shocked the nation. A mother encouraging her son to kill his wife. It was beyond comprehension. Even the prosecutors, hardened men, struggled to speak of it without revulsion. In court, Anna showed no remorse. She spoke softly, almost proudly, describing Hanna as an obstacle between me and my boy. When asked why she did it, she answered, "Because he is mine. He was born of my body. No woman will take him from me." Her words froze the courtroom. The trial became a national spectacle. Reporters from Stockholm wrote breathless columns about the evil of motherly love turned demonic. Psychologists called her case unprecedented. Priests called her possessed. And the public, both horrified and fascinated, began referring to her as the Yingshou witch. Per, broken by guilt, confessed everything. He wept openly, begging forgiveness. The court believed that he had been dominated by his mother's will, her obsession controlling him like a spell. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. Anna was not so lucky. On August 7, 1890, she was sentenced to death by beheading, the last woman in Swedish history to receive that punishment. The execution took place on August 7, 1890, outside the prison in Kristianstad. The weather was gray and silent. Anna walked calmly to the scaffold, dressed in black. Witnesses said she looked composed, even regal. She prayed briefly, crossed herself, and whispered, "Let God judge me, not men." Then she knelt. The executioner raised his axe, one of the last ever used in Sweden. The blade fell. A single stroke. The crowd flinched, and the era of public execution in Sweden ended with her blood on the snow. Her son, Per, lived out his days in prison. He worked as a tailor, wrote letters to pastors, and eventually found religion. He died in 1918, never released, never forgiven. The cottage where the murder took place was burned to the ground soon after the trial. But villagers say the ground never grew grass again. They called it the mother's curse.
For years, Anna Mansdotter's story haunted Sweden. Her name became a symbol of unnatural love, a mother's affection twisted into obsession, a devotion that devoured everything it touched. Some saw her as evil incarnate. Others saw her as a victim of isolation and madness, a woman consumed by loneliness in a cold, unforgiving world. But the truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. Because love, when it loses its limits, becomes its own kind of poison. Anna Mansdotter remains a ghost in Scandinavian history, the final execution, the final blade, the final warning. Her story marked an end of an era, not just for justice, but for how a nation saw women, crime, and the dark corners of the human heart. And to this day,
On cold winter nights in Yingshou, they say a pale figure walks the snow, calling softly into the wind. "Purr, my boy, come back to me." Paris, 1905. The City of Lights was alive with music and motion. Cafes overflowed with laughter, carriages clattered on cobblestones, and gas lamps shimmered along the Seine. But beyond the glitter, in the poor neighborhoods of La Chapelle and La Gouture, families crowded 10 to a room. Mothers worked in laundries, fathers drank their wages, and children played barefoot in alleys thick with coal dust. And in those same alleys, a woman moved quietly from house to house, offering help, comfort, and care. Her name was Jean Weber, and she loved children. She kissed their cheeks, she sang them lullabies, she held them as they died. Jean Weber was born in 1874 in a small town in Normandy. She was the daughter of a fisherman, one of many children in a poor Catholic family. Her childhood was marked by hardship, hunger, abuse, and an early marriage to a laborer named Weber, who drank heavily and worked rarely. When they moved to Paris in the 1890s, she found herself trapped in the same cycle as millions of others: poverty, illness, and despair. 2 of her own children died young, victims of malnutrition and disease. Her mind never recovered from the loss. Neighbors said she became quieter, more withdrawn, more eager to hold other people's babies, as if trying to replace the one she had lost. By 1905, Jean was 31 years old, pale, tired, but with a strangely gentle smile. She was known in her neighborhood as Tante Jean, Aunt Jean, a woman who could calm a crying infant better than any mother. Friends trusted her completely. When they needed to work, they left their babies in her care. And every time, tragedy followed.
It began with her niece. In March of 1905, Jeanne was babysitting her sister's infant daughter, Georgette, when the child suddenly fell ill and died. The doctor wrote, "Asphyxia due to convulsions." No one questioned Jeanne. She was grief-stricken, inconsolable. But only weeks later, another niece, 2-year-old Suzanne, also died while in Jeanne's care. Then another child, and another. Each time, the symptoms were the same: bruises around the neck, blue lips, bulging eyes. And each time, Jeanne wept and prayed with the family. The pattern grew impossible to ignore. By the end of that year, 8 children from her extended family had died after being left with Jeanne. The families were heartbroken, but divided, half convinced she was cursed, half believing she was guilty of something unspeakable. Then one night in 1906, her brother caught her in the act. He had returned home unexpectedly to find Jeanne bending over his 2-year-old son, hands wrapped around the child's throat. He shouted, she screamed, and the child survived, barely. When confronted, Jeanne fainted and refused to speak. Police were called. The neighbors, the doctors, the priests all demanded answers. Finally, Jean Weber was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder. Her trial, held in 1907, shocked Paris. The newspapers called her La tueuse d'enfants, the child killer. Reporters described her as frail and soft-spoken, with calm gray eyes that seemed incapable of cruelty. The courtroom was divided. How could a woman, a mother, kill so many innocent children? The evidence was grim, but circumstantial. No one had seen her kill,
and the autopsies limited by the science of the time, listed asphyxia of uncertain cause. Her defense attorney argued she was a victim of hysteria, grief, and persecution. He painted her as a misunderstood woman suffering from mental collapse after losing her own children. After a brief deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict: not guilty. The courtroom erupted. Some wept in relief, others in fury. Jeanne fainted once more, and when she awoke, she was free.
But freedom only deepened her darkness. After her acquittal, Jean vanished from Paris for a time. She worked briefly as a hospital orderly, then as a housekeeper, always using new names. Wherever she went, children died. In 1908, she took work at a boarding house in the town of Villedieu, owned by an elderly couple named L'Abbé. Their grandson, Marcel, age 7, was left in Jean's care. One afternoon, the boy's grandmother returned to find him struggling for breath. Jean crouched over him, her fingers tight around his neck. The child was dead before anyone could pull her away. This time, there was no doubt. Jean was arrested again, but before she could stand trial, she was declared criminally insane. Doctors diagnosed her with what they called homicidal mania, a rare and little understood condition that made her irresistibly compelled to kill. She was committed to the Salpêtrière Asylum in Paris, the same institution that had once housed hysterics, mystics, and madwomen for centuries. At first, she behaved well, quiet, polite, helpful. But soon, her delusions returned. She claimed to hear the voices of children calling her name at night. Nurses caught her trying to strangle cats, then fellow patients. The doctors finally transferred her to the asylum at Maréville, near Nancy, where she would spend the rest of her life. She died there in 1918, at the age of 44. The records list her cause of death as cachexia due to progressive dementia. But those who worked in the asylum claimed she never stopped whispering, sometimes to the walls, sometimes to the empty air, sometimes to an invisible baby she cradled in her arms. "Hush now. Aunt Jean will make it all better." After her death, Jean Weber became a legend of horror in France. She was called the Ogress of Paris, the Strangler of Angels, the Loving Killer. Writers compared her to a vampire who fed not on blood, but on breath. Her story inspired novels, plays, and psychiatric studies that sought to understand the impossible, how maternal love could transform into its perfect opposite. Some doctors argued she was a victim of post-traumatic madness. Others called her a sadist. But none could explain the serenity with which she killed, or the strange calm that seemed to possess her afterward.
In the end, Jean Weber remains one of the most chilling figures in the history of crime because she represents the corruption of the purest instinct, the love of a mother for a child. She didn't kill for greed, or jealousy, or even revenge. She killed to own the moment of life and death, to feel needed, worshipped, irreplaceable. And in that brief instant when her victims gasped for air and looked into her eyes, she became what she always wanted to be, the center of their world. In the narrow streets of La Goutte d'Or, where the air still smells of bread and coal, the old women whisper her name when the wind rattles the shutters. They say if you leave a cradle empty, she'll come at night to fill it, just for a moment, and you'll wake to find it cold. Chicago, 1912. The city was alive with the hum of progress. Streetcars clattered, factories smoked, and neighborhoods pulsed with the voices of 100 nations. Among them was the Polish district of Little Poland,
where families crowded into narrow brick houses and worked long hours in mills and slaughterhouses. They prayed, they struggled, and they trusted their own, especially a small, kindly widow who lived on West Superior Street. Her name was Tilly Klimek. She was known for her sharp tongue, her black dresses, and her unsettling gift. She could foretell death. When someone in the neighborhood fell ill, Tilly would shake her head solemnly and say, "Don't worry, he won't suffer long. He'll be gone by tomorrow." And she was always right. She was born Teofila Gburek in Poland. Her family immigrated to the United States when she was a child, settling in Chicago's immigrant quarter. Like many young women of her community, she married early. Her husband was John Mitkiewicz, a laborer with a steady job and a fondness for beer. They lived a simple life, surrounded by friends, cousins, and neighbors who shared their language and faith. But by her mid-30s, Tilly had grown restless, tired of poverty, tired of her husband, and tired of being ordinary. And soon the neighbors began to whisper that wherever she went, death followed. It began with her first husband, John. He fell ill suddenly, stomach pains, vomiting, weakness. Tilly nursed him gently, sitting by his bedside and praying. To neighbors, she seemed the perfect grieving wife. She even joked darkly to one of them, saying, "My John will not be long for this world. I've seen it in my dreams." Days later, John was dead. The doctor called it heart failure. Tilly ordered a fine coffin, attended the funeral in mourning black, and accepted the condolences with a serene smile. Then she collected the life insurance. Within months, she remarried.
Her second husband, Joseph Ruszkowski, was younger and healthier. But soon after the wedding, he began to feel the same symptoms: fatigue, nausea, burning stomach. Tilly told her friends, "Poor Joseph, I dreamed he would die soon too." And once again, her dream came true. Another insurance payment, another funeral, another black dress. People began to notice. Not enough to accuse, not yet, but enough to cross themselves when she passed. Her third husband, Frank Kupchik, was warned, but love and superstition blinded him. Tilly was charming when she wished to be, funny and clever, with a wry smile and a reputation for cooking the best stews on the block. Soon after their wedding, Frank complained that the food tasted strange. Tilly laughed. "You're getting old, Frank. Everything tastes strange when you're dying." 2 weeks later, he was. And once again, Tilly claimed she had dreamed it. Neighbors started calling her the psychic widow. They believed she had second sight, a gift from God, or perhaps the devil. But the truth was simpler and deadlier. She wasn't predicting death, she was serving it. Her weapon was arsenic, easily purchased from local shops as rat poison. She mixed it into food, soups, cakes, coffee, and served it with a smile. It was tasteless, odorless, and patient. It killed slowly, giving her time to play the part of the grieving wife while preparing her next victim. And she wasn't alone. Behind her smile was a circle of women, cousins, neighbors, fellow widows, who shared her secrets and sometimes her poison. They called themselves the Polish Black Widows, a loose group of women who killed their husbands for insurance or revenge. Tilly was their queen, the one who always knew when it was time. By 1920, Tilly had buried 3 husbands, several relatives, and even a dog that barked too much. She joked about death constantly. When her cousin Stella came to visit, Tilly offered her a piece of cake and said with a smirk,
Eat up, Stella. You won't have to worry about calories much longer. When Stella fell sick days later and barely survived, she began to suspect, but who would believe her? Tilly was respected, even admired. Then came husband number 4, Joseph Klimek.
At first, their marriage seemed calm. But soon, Joseph complained of stomach pain and weakness. Tilly, as always, played nurse. She even told the neighbors, "I dreamed poor Joe won't see another month." Her dreams were so precise that the neighbors joked nervously about her gift. But when Joseph became gravely ill and doctors found arsenic in his system, the laughter stopped. Stella, her cousin, finally came forward, accusing Tilly directly. Police exhumed the bodies of her former husbands. Every one of them was saturated with poison. When officers came to arrest her, Tilly was sitting by her husband's bed, spooning soup into his mouth. She didn't resist. She smiled and said, "You're too late. He'll be gone by morning." She was right. He died within hours. The trial of Tilly Klimek in 1923 became front-page news across America. Reporters dubbed her Chicago's psychic killer and the Polish Black Widow. The courtroom was packed with curious crowds, eager to see the small, stern-faced woman who could predict death like a weather forecast. When asked if she had poisoned her husbands, she replied calmly, "I dreamed they would die. The dream came true, that's all." Her humor unsettled everyone. At one point, when shown a vial of arsenic, she smiled and said, "Ah yes, my little helper." Her composure never cracked. She laughed during testimony, whispered jokes to guards, and seemed delighted by the attention. Even as witness after witness described her prophecies, her cold meals, her laughing at funerals, she remained serene, almost bored. The jury took less than an hour to decide. Guilty. She was sentenced to life imprisonment at Joliet State Penitentiary, spared the death penalty only because of her gender and age. When reporters asked if she regretted her actions, she replied, "Regret? Only I regret that I ran out of dreams." She spent the rest of her life behind bars, where her dark humor made her both feared and famous. She told guards she could still dream death, and that the warden should watch his back. Even other prisoners avoided her. They said her eyes were too calm, the eyes of someone who'd already seen the end. Tilly Klimek died in prison in 1936 at the age of 60. Her grave bears no name, only a number, but her legend still drifts through Chicago's old neighborhoods, a whisper in Polish, a warning in the wind.
Her story is both grotesque and strangely human, a blend of superstition, greed, and cunning born from a world where women had little power and even less freedom. She turned death into her currency, her language, her entertainment, and she laughed all the way to the gallows of history. Today, in Chicago's Polish Quarter, there's an old superstition. If you dream of someone dying, you must light a candle before sunrise, or Tilly Klimek will come for you in the dark. Because even in death, they say, she still dreams, and her dreams always come true. Hamburg, 1902. A city of smoke and ships, of sailors and merchants, of laughter that never reached the poorest streets. At night, fog rolled in from the Elbe River. swallowing the narrow alleys of St. Georg, a district known for its poverty, its brothels, and its secrets. Among those secrets was a small, unremarkable house at 36 Kleinen Pulverteig Street. It smelled faintly of herbs and milk. Sometimes the smell was worse. And inside lived a woman everyone knew simply as Frau Wiese. To the neighbors, she was a midwife, a kindly woman who helped young girls in trouble, unmarried, ashamed, desperate. They came to her at night, carrying shame in their bellies and hope in their hearts. She promised to make everything right, and she did, in the darkest way imaginable. Elizabeth Wiese was born in 1853 in Hemmelingen, a quiet suburb near Bremen. Her childhood was ordinary, poor, strict, Lutheran. She married young to a tobacco worker and had several children. By her 30s, she was working as a midwife, one of the few respectable jobs available to women of her class. She was good at it, too, calm, confident, practical. She knew pain, she knew fear, and she knew how to hide both. But beneath her starched uniform and soft voice was something cold. When her husband began drinking and the family fell into debt, she found herself facing the same trap as the women she helped: poverty, humiliation, despair. And that's when she discovered that there was money to be made from other people's secrets. At the time, abortion was illegal in Germany, and illegitimate birth was a scandal. Unwed mothers were cast out, fired from their jobs, and left with no support. For many, the only option was to give their babies to strangers or to women like Elizabeth Wiese, who promised adoption and discretion.
For a small fee, she offered to place newborns with wealthy families. The mothers, terrified and grateful, signed papers and left their children in her care. They never saw them again. At first, the mothers believed her stories. She told them the babies were sent to good homes, to ladies of standing. She said they should move on, start fresh, forget. And they did. But the babies never left her house. Behind closed doors, Frau Wiese became something else. She began killing the infants, sometimes by suffocation, sometimes with morphine, sometimes simply by neglect. Then she burned their bodies in her stove, feeding the ashes to the fire that warmed her home. The smell of roasted meat drifted through the narrow streets, and the neighbors complained. She told them she was burning spoiled pork. It was true, in a way. Her crimes grew bolder, her methods more refined. When she ran out of space in her stove, she dumped the remains in the canals that ran through Hamburg's poorer districts. Dogs dragged bones onto the cobblestones. Still, no one asked questions. In the slums, death was as common as rain. To the world, she remained a respectable midwife. She even worked for doctors, attending births at hospitals and homes. She wore her hair neatly, carried prayer books, and spoke kindly to the poor. But when she returned home, she turned from healer to executioner. Eventually, she expanded her trade. She began forging adoption papers and demanding larger fees. When a mother hesitated, she threatened to expose her. She learned to manipulate shame as skillfully as she had once cut umbilical cords. Her own daughter, Paula, assisted her for a time, though whether out of fear or greed, no one knows. Together, they disposed of dozens of infants, and when the money ran out, Elizabeth turned to another crime: blackmail. She began writing letters to the fathers of these illegitimate children, threatening to reveal their affairs unless they paid. Many did. Some refused. Those who refused sometimes vanished too.
By 1901, rumors had begun to spread. Stray dogs unearthed small bones near the canals. Doctors noticed that certain mothers who had given birth under Weiss's care never returned for postnatal visits, nor did their babies. But fear and shame kept everyone silent. Then, one day, a neighbor saw something she couldn't unsee. Elizabeth was carrying a heavy parcel wrapped in cloth out of her home. When she thought no one was looking, she threw it into the water. The next morning, it washed ashore. Inside were the remains of a newborn child. The police raided her house. What they found turned even hardened officers pale. Dozens of bundles hidden in cupboards and chests, tiny bones, blood-stained rags, bottles labeled morphium. Her stove was filled with ash and bone fragments. A doctor later testified that the remains belonged to at least 5 infants, though the true number was likely far higher, perhaps 50 or more. Elizabeth was calm when they arrested her. She claimed innocence at first, saying the babies had died naturally. When confronted with the evidence, she smiled faintly and said, "They were better off dead. The world is no place for bastards." Her trial in 1903 drew enormous crowds. Women fainted when the charges were read aloud. Reporters described her as a grim, emotionless matron with eyes like 2 dead coins. The defense tried to argue insanity, but she was too composed, too rational. Every word she spoke revealed not madness, but cold intent. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Elizabeth Weiss was convicted of murder and sentenced to death by guillotine. She waited in prison for nearly a year as appeals were rejected. During that time, she read her Bible daily and claimed to be, quote, ready to meet God. But she never confessed. On February 2, 1905, at dawn, she was led to the courtyard of the Hamburg prison. Witnesses said she walked steadily, her face expressionless beneath the morning mist. When asked if she had final words, she replied, "May God forgive those who brought me here." Moments later, the blade fell. After her death, newspapers across Europe struggled to describe her. They called her the devil's midwife, the baby butcher of Hamburg, and the fiend in the nursery. But even those words felt small compared to the scale of her crimes. What made her terrifying was not just what she did, but why. She believed she was cleaning the world, removing shame, saving the poor from scandal, purifying sin with fire. To her, it was practical, almost moral. That is what separates monsters like Elizabeth Wiese from ordinary killers. They don't act out of rage, they act out of conviction. In Hamburg, her house no longer stands, but locals say that on foggy nights, the scent of burning milk still lingers near the canal, and the faint cry of an infant echoes through the mist, a reminder that some fires never go out. Romania, 1925. The world was changing. Cars on the streets, jazz on the radios, women with short hair and sharper minds. But in the countryside, the old ways still lingered. Silence, secrecy, and the slow decay of grand houses that no longer held grand families. And in one such house, at the edge of the small town of Berkasovo, lived a woman named Vera Renzi. The neighbors called her beautiful. They called her tragic. And when her name finally reached the newspapers, they called her something else, the Black Widow of Romania. She was born in 1903, the only child of a wealthy banker. Her mother died when she was young, and her father adored her. He gave her everything, tutors, dresses, music, refinement, everything except boundaries. By the time she was 13, men already turned to stare when she entered a room.
By 16, she was restless and spoiled, convinced that the world existed for her amusement. And at 20, she discovered love. Or rather, her version of it, a feverish, consuming hunger to possess. Her first husband was Karl Schick, a handsome Austrian businessman 15 years her senior. They married quickly, passionately. For a few months, they were inseparable. Then Karl began to travel for work, short trips that grew longer, letters that grew fewer. Vera's mind filled with suspicion. She imagined other women, imagined betrayal, imagined losing the one thing she couldn't bear to lose: control. One evening, she prepared him a special dinner, his favorite stew, served with wine from her father's cellar. They dined by candlelight. He told her he was leaving again the next day. She smiled. He never woke up. She told the servants he had gone on another business trip. Weeks later, when they asked if he'd returned, she said softly, "No, he's gone for good." No one asked further.
Months passed. Vera dressed in black and received condolences. Then she remarried, this time to Joseph Renzi, a soldier with a steady income and a weakness for her beauty. They had one son, Lorenzo. For a time, it seemed happiness had finally found her. But Vera's jealousy was like a slow-burning fuse. Joseph was sociable, charming, often away on duty. When he returned home late one night, the scent of perfume clinging to his uniform, Vera's temper ignited. The next morning, Joseph was found dead in his bed. Heart failure, said the doctor. Vera wept convincingly and buried him in the family crypt. Then she withdrew from society. Only her little boy remained, quiet, pale, always at her side. Years later, when Lorenzo grew older, the pattern repeated. He became handsome, independent, and curious about the world beyond his mother's walls. He spoke of leaving, of studying, of marriage. Vera forbade it. He argued. For the first time, he defied her. Neighbors heard shouting, then silence. After that, no one saw Lorenzo again. Vera told friends he had gone abroad. Some believed her. Others noticed that she began visiting the cellar more often, always alone, always at night. As time passed, Vera's house became a mausoleum of quiet. She took lovers, many of them, young men from the city, businessmen passing through, even married neighbors who fell for her beauty. She promised affection, secrecy, devotion. They vanished, one by one. When questioned, she said they had left her, as men always did. She sighed, she smiled sadly, she poured more wine. But in truth, she was keeping them. The rumors began with a police officer's wife. Her husband, Milan Popovich, had been visiting Vera in secret. When he failed to return home, his wife grew suspicious. She confronted Vera, who dismissed her coldly. "Men are weak," she said. "Perhaps he found someone else." But the wife refused to accept it. She went to the police. Reluctantly, they agreed to investigate, quietly. When officers arrived at Vera's estate, she greeted them politely. Her beauty had not faded. Her composure was flawless. She invited them inside for tea. But when they asked to see the cellar, her smile faltered. She hesitated, then led them down. The door creaked open to reveal rows of metal coffins, 32 of them, neatly arranged, each labeled with a name written in Vera's elegant hand. The air was thick with the smell of decay and formaldehyde. Inside each coffin lay a man, perfectly preserved, their faces peaceful, their clothes immaculate. Among them was her husband, Joseph, and her son, Lorenzo. The officers froze. Vera watched them, expressionless. Then she said quietly, "I kept them because they were mine." She was arrested on the spot. During interrogation, she confessed without hesitation. She described how she had poisoned each man with arsenic or strychnine, usually mixed into wine. She said she couldn't bear to be abandoned, that killing them ensured they would never leave her. "They would all have left me," she told the judge, "but this way they stayed, forever." The newspapers devoured her story. Europe was captivated. Headlines called her the Romanian Borgia, the Vampire Countess, the woman who loved to death. But behind the sensationalism was something colder, the emptiness of a woman whose only understanding of love was possession. Her trial, held in 1925, lasted only a few weeks. The court heard testimony from neighbors, servants, and surviving relatives. The evidence was overwhelming. She was found guilty of 35 murders, though police suspected as many as 50. Her victims ranged from teenage lovers to middle-aged businessmen. She was sentenced to life imprisonment in a women's penitentiary near Belgrade. There she lived quietly, her beauty fading, her mind crumbling. She refused visitors, refused to speak. She spent her days polishing her cell's metal bars, as if tending to her coffins again. In 1960, when the guards entered her cell one morning, they found her sitting upright, eyes open, a faint smile on her lips. She was holding a faded photograph of her son, and in the other hand, a small vial, empty. Poison, her last love letter to herself.
Vera Renzi remains one of the most chilling figures in European crime, a woman who turned love into obsession and jealousy into ritual. She didn't kill for profit. She killed to preserve affection, to freeze time, to stop abandonment before it began. In her mind, death was the only kind of devotion that could never betray her. And so, the woman who couldn't bear loneliness filled her home with company, silent, faithful, and eternal. Today, the ruins of her estate still stand, half swallowed by vines and silence. Locals say the cellar doors are sealed, but at night you can hear the echo of metal lids opening and the faint, lilting whisper of a woman's voice saying, "Don't go. Stay with me. Forever." England, 1899. The century was closing, and with it came the uneasy calm before a new age. Electric lights flickered where candles once burned, trains carved through fields, and the world believed it was becoming more civilized, more humane. But humanity, as history has shown, hides its darkest truths in the softest faces. In the small Hertfordshire town of Hatfield, a young woman worked as a domestic servant. She was polite, quiet, and dutiful, the kind of girl employers trusted without question. Her name was Marianne Ansell, and she would become the last woman ever hanged in England for poisoning her own sister. Marianne was born in 1878, the second of 7 children in a poor working-class family. Her father was a laborer. Her mother took in washing. Life was hard, but ordinary. The kind of poverty that didn't shock anyone, because everyone shared it. From a young age, Marianne learned to obey, to endure, and to keep secrets. Her older sister Caroline was different, fragile, sensitive, always unwell. As a teenager, she began to show signs of what doctors then called nervous disorder, most likely epilepsy or mental illness. The family, unable to care for her, placed her in an asylum near St. Albans, Leavesden Asylum for Imbeciles and Idiots, a grim institution whose name alone carried the cruelty of its time. Marianne visited often. She brought small gifts, cakes, sweets, ribbons. The attendants liked her. They said she was kind, devoted. And perhaps she was, but beneath that devotion, something darker was forming.
By her early 20s, Marianne had taken work in London as a maid. It was lonely, hard work, but respectable. Her wages were small, her days long, and her nights longer still. She worried about her family, about Caroline, about everything except herself. Then, sometime in 1898, a letter arrived from home. Her parents were struggling, money was short, Caroline's care was costly. The asylum demanded payment, and the family couldn't afford it. Marianne's visits became less frequent. The burden weighed on her, the guilt, the helplessness, the endless drudgery of trying to hold a collapsing world together. And then, one afternoon, something broke. She decided that the only true act of kindness she could offer her sister was release. It began with a letter. Marianne wrote to a local chemist using a false name, claiming she needed rat poison for farm use. The chemist sent her a packet of strychnine, a deadly bitter powder. She hid it in her pocket for weeks, carrying death to and from her employer's house like a secret charm. On a Sunday in April 1899, she visited her sister at Leavesden Asylum. Caroline greeted her with shy delight. They sat in the garden, the spring air heavy with lilacs. Marianne gave her a small box of chocolates, wrapped neatly in brown paper. Caroline smiled. She always loved sweets. Marianne kissed her forehead and said, "You'll feel better soon." That night, Caroline screamed. Her body convulsed violently, her mouth foaming, her limbs rigid. The attendants could do nothing. By morning, she was dead.
At first, it seemed like another tragedy among many. The asylum was filled with death, few ever left alive. But one nurse, curious about the chocolates, tasted a crumb left behind. Her tongue went numb. She called for the doctor. Tests revealed strychnine. When police traced the package, the handwriting led back to Mary Ann Ansell. They found her still working quietly at her employer's house, ironing linens, humming softly. When she was arrested, she didn't struggle. She only said, "I didn't mean harm. I only wanted peace for her." Her trial, held at the Old Bailey, captured national attention. The newspapers painted her as a tragic figure, a poor girl driven by love and desperation. The defense argued that she had acted out of mercy, not malice. They described her sister's suffering, the asylum's misery, the family's poverty. Marianne herself barely spoke. When asked why she poisoned her sister, she answered quietly, "She was unhappy. I wanted her to rest." The jury deliberated for less than an hour. Guilty. The judge, pale and hesitant, pronounced the sentence of death. Even he seemed shaken by the case. A crime without greed, without rage, only twisted compassion. In the weeks before her execution, public sympathy grew. Petitions for clemency circulated through London. Thousands signed them. Even Queen Victoria was said to have hesitated, considering mercy. But the Home Secretary refused. The law, he said, must be the same for all. On July 19, 1899, at Holloway Prison, Marianne Ansell was led to the gallows. She wore a plain black dress and carried a small cross.
When asked for final words, she whispered, "God knows my heart." The trapdoor opened, the rope tightened, and the last woman of the Victorian century swung silently into history. Her body was buried within the prison grounds, unmarked. Her family never claimed it. Caroline's grave, too, lies forgotten, a small stone in the asylum cemetery, its inscription long eroded by rain. But their story remains, a final echo of an age where madness, poverty, and love could twist themselves into murder.
Mary Ann Ansell's case is still debated by historians. Was she a murderer or a misguided angel? Did she act out of pity or out of pride? The desire to decide who should live and who should die. The truth lies somewhere between mercy and monstrosity, because that's the line all of these women walked, the forgotten killers of history. They didn't kill for the thrill of blood, but for the illusion of control, to end suffering, to end fear, to end loneliness. And in doing so, they became part of the very darkness they thought they could master. As the curtain closes on this journey, from Hungary to Japan, from the frozen fields of Norway to the burning streets of India, one truth remains constant. Evil has many faces. Sometimes it wears lace and perfume. Sometimes it smiles kindly and brings soup to the sick. Sometimes it whispers, "I only wanted to help." But behind those words is a lesson carved into every chapter you've just heard, that power, love, faith, and mercy, when warped by obsession, can all lead to the same place: a quiet house, a locked door, and the echo of someone saying, "Don't be afraid, you'll be at peace soon." And so ends our story. Forgotten female serial killers of history. 18 chapters of beauty and brutality, of kindness turned cruel, of women lost between victim and villain. They're gone, their crimes buried, their names fading into whispers. But if you listen closely, you might still hear them in the dark, the soft voices of those who loved too much and killed because of it. Would you like me to write a short epilogue? A reflective closing monologue tying all 18 chapters together into one final haunting conclusion?